The woman on the train platform in Dusty Redemption, Texas, looked like a porcelain doll someone had left in the sun to crack. Her white prairie dress, meticulously clean despite the journey, was a beacon against the dun-colored clapboard of the station. She stood perfectly still beside a single small wooden chest, her hands clasped in front of her, her gaze fixed on something far beyond the shimmering heat rising from the tracks. Silas Blackwood reined in his old gray horse, the wagon creaking to a halt. He had been expecting a sturdy German girl named Helga. The letters, exchanged over 6 painstaking months, had described a woman with hands strong enough to milk a stubborn goat and pull weeds. He had sent nearly his last dollar to the agency in San Francisco for her passage, a desperate gamble to find a partner who could help him save his failing ranch. This woman was not Helga. She was small, fine-boned, and Chinese. Her face was a mask of calm, but her knuckles were white where she gripped her hands together. Silas swung down from the wagon, his worn boots kicking up puffs of ochre dust. He was a man built of long, lean lines, his face weathered by sun and worry. He approached the station master, a portly man named Henderson who was sweating through his shirt despite standing in the shade. "Henderson, I'm here for my passenger," Silas said, his voice low and raspy from disuse. "From the eastbound train." Henderson mopped his brow with a gray handkerchief. "That's her, Blackwood. The only one who got off," he gestured with his thumb toward the woman. "Came all the way from California." Silas's jaw tightened. "That's not the woman I was expecting. There's been a mistake." "No mistake on my end," Henderson said, already turning away. "Name on her ticket matched the name on the wire. Said she was for you. The agency paid her passage. My job's done." A cold knot formed in Silas's stomach. This was more than a mistake. It felt deliberate. He walked over to the woman, stopping a few feet away. The sun was brutal, a physical weight. She finally looked at him, her eyes dark and unreadable. He began, then faltered. He had rehearsed a greeting for Helga, something about the long journey and the work ahead. The words felt foolish now. He tried again. "I'm Silas Blackwood. I think there's been some confusion." She gave a slight, formal bow, a gesture so out of place in the gritty Texas heat that it was jarring. "I am Lin Jing," she said. Her voice was quiet, the words precise, though tinged with an accent he couldn't place. "I was sent for you." He looked from her pristine dress to her delicate hands, hands that looked like they had never seen a day of hard labor. He thought of his failing cattle, the fences that needed mending, the well that threatened to run dry. They had sent him a doll. A useless, beautiful doll. He could feel the eyes of the town on him from the windows of the general store and the saloon. He could already hear the laughter. But there was the wooden chest at her feet, and the finality in the station master's voice. He had paid for her passage. Leaving her here was impossible. She would have nowhere to go, no money, no protection. Whatever this was, whatever trick had been played, she was caught in it just as much as he was. With a sigh that seemed to pull up dust from the bottom of his soul, he gestured to the wagon. "All right then," he said, his voice flat. "Get in." The ride to the ranch was a long, silent affair, punctuated only by the rhythmic clop of the horse's hooves and the groan of the wagon wheels. Lin Jing sat straight-backed on the bench, not looking at the passing landscape of mesquite and dry grass, but staring straight ahead. Silas felt a slow-burning anger. This had the stink of Frank Bishop all over it. Bishop, his neighbor, whose sprawling ranch bordered Silas's meager property, had been trying to buy him out for years, using every dirty trick he could imagine. Sending Silas a bride he couldn't possibly use, a bride who would be a burden and a source of ridicule, was exactly Bishop's style of cruelty. As they turned onto the rutted track that led to his homestead, the small, unpainted cabin and rickety corral came into view. It wasn't much, and seeing it through a stranger's eyes made it look even poorer. He pulled the wagon to a stop near the porch. "This is it," he said, the words tasting like ash. Lin Jing surveyed the scene, the thirster-looking vegetable patch, the small herd of thin longhorns huddled in the shade of a lone oak, the palpable sense of a place holding on by a thread. She said nothing, her expression unreadable. She slid gracefully from the wagon before he could offer a hand and walked to her wooden chest. It was small, but he grunted with surprise at its weight when he lifted it onto the porch. For 3 days, they moved around each other like ghosts in the small cabin. She was unnervingly clean and tidy. She swept the floorboards until they were bare, washed the few dishes he owned until they shone, and mended a tear in his work shirt with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She did not, however, seem to know one end of a hoe from the other, and she flinched when one of the cows made a sudden move. She was, as he had feared, utterly useless for the work that mattered. On the 4th day, Frank Bishop made his appearance. He rode up on a magnificent black stallion, a stark contrast to Silas's aging grey. Bishop was a large man, dressed in fine leather and a clean Stetson, a wide smile on his face that never reached his cold eyes. "Blackwood," he boomed, staying on his horse to look down at Silas. "I heard you had an arrival." Came to welcome the new lady to the neighborhood. His eyes flickered to Lin Jing, who had come to the cabin door. He gave her a long, insolent look, a smirk playing on his lips. "Not quite what the advertisements promise, is she?" Bit on the small side for Texas. Silas's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "She's fine, Bishop." "What do you want?" "Just being neighborly," Bishop said, his smile widening. "And to renew my offer. This is hard country. It takes a certain kind of stock to make it. Man, woman, or beast. I'll still give you a fair price for this place before you run it completely into the ground." Lin Jing stepped out onto the porch, her gaze level. She looked directly at Bishop, her calm a stark contrast to the simmering rage coming off Silas. She said nothing, but her stare was so direct, so unnervingly steady, that Bishop's smile faltered for a moment. He quickly recovered. "You think on it, Blackwood," he said, tipping his hat with mock politeness. He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and humiliation in his wake. Silas didn't look at Lin Jing. He turned and walked toward the corral, the shame hot on his neck. What he found there drove all thoughts of Bishop from his mind. One of his best heifers was down, lying on its side, its breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. A strange foam flecked its lips. A cold dread, colder than any winter morning, seized him. He had seen this sickness before, a blight that could sweep through a herd and leave nothing but carcasses and debt. Over the next week, the dread became a living nightmare. 2 more cows fell ill, then a young bull. They grew weak, refused to eat, and wasted away with a fever that burned them up from the inside. Silas worked tirelessly, hauling water, trying to force-feed them mashes of grain and molasses, but it was like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in it. He was losing everything. The small herd was the only thing of value he had left in the world. He saw Lin Jing watching from a distance. She no longer tried to help in the garden or the cabin. Instead, she began to walk the pastures, her head down, studying the ground. She would stoop to pick a leaf from a weed, crumble it in her fingers, and smell it. She'd examine the roots of the dry grass. Silas, consumed by his panic, barely noticed. He thought she was just wandering, uselessly passing the time while his world collapsed. One evening, as he sat on the porch steps, his head in his hands, the smell of defeat thick in the air, she approached him. She held out a wooden bowl. It was filled with a dark, pungent-smelling pulp of crushed leaves, roots, and some kind of clay from the creek bed. "For the cattle," she said softly. Silas looked from the strange concoction to her earnest face. "What is that?" "Some kind of superstition," he snapped, his frayed nerves making him cruel. "I'm trying to save my herd, not poison them with weeds." Her expression didn't change. She didn't flinch from his anger. "This is not poison," she said, her voice even. "The plant with the yellow flower, it cools the fire. The root from the creek, it cleans the blood. My grandfather taught me." He stared at her. It was the most she had said at one time since she arrived. He wanted to dismiss it, to tell her to go back to her mending and leave the real work to him. But the truth was, his real work was failing. 3 cows were dead, and another was close. He had nothing left to lose. He looked at the bowl again, then at the dying calf in the small pen he'd made, its breathing already slowing. "Fine," he grunted, getting to his feet. "We'll try it on the calf. It makes no difference now." Together, they worked, prying open the calf's weak jaw while Silas spooned the thick, earthy paste onto its tongue. It was a messy, difficult business. The calf was too weak to struggle much. When they were done, Silas stood back, wiping his hands on his trousers, feeling foolish and desperate. He expected nothing. But the next morning, the calf was standing. It was wobbly, uncertain, but it was on its feet. When Silas brought a bucket of water, it drank, its thirst deep and life-affirming. He stared, disbelieving. He found Lin Jing by the creek, her dress hitched up, digging for more of the pale, thick root she had used. She looked up as he approached, her hands covered in mud. For the first time, Silas saw past the porcelain doll. He saw the quiet intensity in her eyes, the deliberate, knowledgeable way she handled the plants. He didn't understand what she had done, but he could not deny the result. "Show me," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Show me which ones." They worked side by side for the next 3 days. She showed him the plants to gather, a bitter, yellow-flowered weed he'd always cursed, a type of broadleaf plantain, and the slick, pale roots from the creek. They pounded them into a pulp using a hollowed-out log and a heavy stone. They mixed it with clay and water and administered it to every sick animal. It was back-breaking, relentless work. They barely slept, communicating with gestures and simple, direct words. In the shared, desperate labor, a fragile truce grew between them. He began to see not her delicacy, but her stamina. She never complained, never faltered. On the third night, the last of the sick cows finally drank on its own. The fever in the herd had broken. They were weak, gaunt, but they would live. Exhausted, they sat on the porch as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and orange. The air was cool for the first time in weeks. "You saved them," Silas said, the admission costing his pride something, but the gratitude was stronger. "How did you know?" Lin Jing was silent for a long moment, tracing a pattern on the dusty porch floor with her finger. "My family, in my home village," she began, her voice low. "They were not farmers. They were scholars. Healers. They read the signs in the body, and the signs in the earth. They knew which plants held life, and which held death." She looked up at him, and for the first time, he saw a profound sadness in her eyes, a history he couldn't begin to imagine. "There was a sickness in my village. Much fighting. My family lost everything. I was sold to a man who promised passage to America. He said I would be a wife to a rich man." She gave a small, humorless smile. "The agency in San Francisco, they are not honest men. They take the money. They send who they have. Bishop, he paid them extra. He told them to send the one who looked the most useless." The pieces clicked into place. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Bishop hadn't just wanted to saddle him with a wife who couldn't work, he had deliberately chosen a woman who would be an object of scorn, a woman whose foreignness would isolate Silas even further. Silas felt a wave of shame so profound it was like a physical blow. He had looked at her and seen exactly what Bishop had wanted him to see. He had judged her, dismissed her, and all the while, she held the knowledge that had just saved his entire livelihood. "I'm sorry," he said, the words inadequate. "I was wrong about you." She simply nodded, accepting the apology without ceremony. She reached into a pocket in her dress and pulled out a small, worn silk pouch. She opened it carefully, showing him the contents. Inside were a dozen tiny, dark seeds. "All I have left of my home," she whispered. "Seeds for herbs of healing. I thought I would plant a small garden. For memory." He looked at the seeds, then at her face, illuminated by the rising moon. He had thought they sent him a burden. He was wrong. They had sent him the one person in the whole territory who could save him. But he did not yet know that their fight was far from over. The next week, as the cattle slowly regained their strength, Bishop returned. He wasn't alone. He had the territorial land agent with him, a man named Peters with a thin mustache and paperwork in his hand. "Blackwood," Bishop said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "I heard about your troubles with the sickness. A terrible shame. I'm sure you're stretched thin." "The herd is recovering," Silas said flatly, standing on the porch with Lin Jing just behind him in the doorway. "That's good to hear," Bishop said, though his eyes said otherwise. "But business is business. Mr. Peters here has some papers for you. It seems the note on your land, the one held by the bank in Austin, has been sold. I'm your new creditor." He smiled, a predator's grin. "And I'm calling it due. You have 30 days to pay the full amount. $500. $500. Silas felt the blood drain from his face. He might as well have asked for the moon. He had less than $10 to his name. This was it. This was the checkmate. "That's impossible," Silas managed to say. "It's business," Bishop repeated. He looked past Silas to Lin Jing. "Don't worry. When I own this place, I'm sure I can find some work for your companion. Maybe in the laundry." Something inside Silas snapped. He took a step forward, his hands balled into fists, but Lin Jing's hand on his arm stopped him. Her touch was light, but firm. He looked back at her. Her face was calm, but her eyes were like chips of flint. 30 days, Bishop said, savoring his victory. He and Peters turned their horses and rode away. That night, the weight of utter defeat settled over the small cabin. Silas sat at the rough-hewn table, staring at the foreclosure notice. It was over. All his work, his father's work before him, gone. "There is a way," Lin Jing said, her voice cutting through the silence. He looked up. "There's no way. There's no money. Sell the healthy ones," she said. "Not all of them. The 10 strongest. The ones who recovered the quickest. They will fetch a good price at the market in Fort Worth. Enough for a payment. Enough to buy time." He stared at her as if she were mad. "Sell my breeding stock? That's my future. It would be starting over with nothing." "We are already at nothing," she replied, her logic unassailable. "Nothing is the best place to start over. We save the root. The tree will grow again." She tapped the silk pouch of seeds that now sat on the table between them. "And we will plant a different kind of garden." He looked at her, at the quiet certainty in her face. It was a crazy gamble, selling the very heart of his herd to save the dirt it stood on. But she was right. Bishop thought he had broken him, left him with a sick herd and a useless woman. He didn't know that the sick herd was healing, and the woman was the furthest thing from useless he had ever known. A flicker of defiance sparked within him. He would not let Bishop win. "All right," he said, his voice firm for the first time in days. "We'll do it." A year later, the sun beat down on a very different scene at the Blackwood Ranch. The fences were mended, the cabin had a new coat of whitewash, and the vegetable patch was overflowing. But the most significant change was in the pasture. The herd was larger now, nearly 50 head of cattle, and they were unlike any others in the county. They were a crossbreed, sired by a hardy Brahmin bull Silas had bought with the last of their money after the sale in Fort Worth. These cattle were leaner, tougher, and more resistant to heat and sickness than the old Longhorns. They grazed not just on grass, but on specially cultivated patches of fodder Lin Jing had grown from seed she had carefully selected and nurtured. Her garden was now a series of small, fenced-off plots where she grew strange-looking herbs and nutrient-rich plants he had never seen before. This supplemental feed kept the herd healthy and strong, even through the driest parts of the summer. Their calves were healthier, grew faster, and fetched a higher price than any others. News of the Blackwood method had spread. Ranchers who had once laughed at Silas now came to him, hats in hand, asking to buy Lin Jing's herbal remedies for their own sick animals. The small pouches of dried, fragrant herbs became another source of income, one that slowly but surely allowed them to pay down the remainder of the debt to Bishop. Frank Bishop's fortunes, meanwhile, had turned. The sickness had eventually spread to his vast herds, and his brute force methods couldn't stop it. He lost nearly a third of his cattle. He was land-rich but cash-poor, his power in the county diminished. He no longer rode by to taunt them. One afternoon, Silas stood by the corral, watching Lin Jing move among the cattle. She was no longer dressed in the pristine white prairie dress. She wore a simple, durable work dress of blue cotton, her sleeves rolled up, her hands dusty but capable. She moved with a quiet confidence, laying a calming hand on a nervous heifer, her presence a balm to the entire herd. She was no longer a porcelain doll, she was the heart of this ranch. He walked up to her, holding a piece of paper in his hand. It was a new deed, drawn up by the agent in town, officially listing the property under two names, Silas Blackwood and Lin Jing. He held it out to her. "This is yours," he said. "Half of everything. It was always yours." She took the paper, her fingers brushing his. She read the document, and a slow, beautiful smile spread across her face, transforming her features. It was the first time he had seen her truly smile. She looked up from the paper, at him, at the healthy herd, at the land that was now their shared future. "We saved the root," she said softly. "Yes," Silas replied, his voice thick. "We did." He knew then that Frank Bishop, in his arrogance and cruelty, had made a colossal miscalculation. He had tried to send Silas a weakness to break him. Instead, he had sent him his greatest strength. He had sent a useless bride, and she had built not just the richest herd in Texas, but a home. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.